To critique 513. Reading capital. One can hardly think of a more appropriate critical text to read in this seminar, Critique 1313, on reading critical texts than reading capital, than reading capital, that is. So we read The Second Sex, we read Horkheimer and Adorno, but today we are reading capital, and that mirroring effect, that doubling, I hope, does not escape you. It can't escape you. What those students were doing, those students at the École Normale Supérieure, Etienne Balibar, Jacques Rancière, Roger Establet, Pierre Macheret, with their pedagogue, Louis Althusser, we are doing today among us, and of course surprisingly, wonderfully, again with none other than Etienne Balibar, who is here today as a former student, as an author, as a pedagogue, but especially as a student with us tonight. And our mission is to read this text today in the same presentist manner, I would argue, the same presentist manner that Althusser, Balibar, Rancière, etc. read Capital in 1965. Needless to remind you, at the time, this book, right, Lire le Capital, the complete edition which we have, this book was met with ferocious resistance and controversy because it was a contemporary intervention. And I want our readings today to also be a contemporary intervention. I want it to be met with just as much controversy in this room, but controversy grounded in today's political crises, not the controversies surrounding 1965, Stalinism, 1956, the Cold War, or even May 68. Now, this book may seem academic to many students today. It may seem somewhat confusing and disconnected to today's reality. But know that it was a hand grenade at the time. A hand grenade that elicited within the left, among Marxists, a vicious and brutal reaction. You can look back at its reception and the vitriolic reactions in our bibliography, and you must look at those reactions. You must look at the reactions of the great British Marxist historian, E.P. Thompson, author of the classics you have all read, The Making of the English Working Class, The Moral Economy of the English Crowd, editor of Albion's Fatal Tree, Crime and Society in 18th Century England, which you have to read. Albion's Fatal Tree, probably one of the most important texts for us in this punitive society.
Tell you how I spoke to him.
Okay, good. I want to hear that. We want to hear that. E.P. Thompson declared war on this book, right? Quote, "I declare unrelenting intellectual war against such Marxisms," right? Unrelenting intellectual war. And I do so from within a tradition, one of whose major founders was Marx, Thompson wrote, right? Or Leszek Kolakowski, the British philosopher, historian of ideas, exiled to All Souls College. Not a bad place to be exiled to. Quote, "The whole construction, in spite of the verbal claims to scientificity, is a gratuitous ideological project intended to preserve a certain traditional model of Marxism typical of Stalinist communism," right? These books were bombs. And as an aside, I just should emphasize that Etienne curated a remarkable bibliography that is on the website under 513. It's the reading section. And that bibliography alone is worth the price of admission tonight. So look at it and also read his preface to the Chinese edition, which was translated beautifully by Xavier Fleury. Thank you again, Xavier. Also read the short introduction that will preface this, particularly for anyone who's kind of listening again. You can stop and read those things and then come back to this. This book was a bomb in its time, but what we are trying to do is figure out how we can use it today, how we can deploy it in our political struggles, and how. Those are the questions we'd like to address. And we're going to approach them, and we're going to approach this task in a series of 3 questions. 1, about the project of reading capital. 2, about the method of reading capital. 3, about how we can deploy the book for purposes of our own struggles. Very quickly, let me go over these 3 dimensions. 1, the project. If you open your text, turn to page 13 of the English text, right? What is it to read? That is essentially how Althusser frames this book in the very first pages of Reading Capital. What is it to read? And that, of course, as I will remind you, was the way we framed the original question of our seminar, of our first seminar, In Search of a Method. Althusser turns to Marx to answer that question because he finds in Marx, right, one of the greatest readers in history. Now, what's so important about Marx in this context, especially for Althusser, is what a remarkable and acharné reader he was of Smith, Ricardo, and the classical political economists. Marx was a reader, a voracious reader, and that fact alone is of significance to Althusser. It indicates to him the centrality of reading to discovering, in this case, a science. Now, you'll recall that during the first seminar, Etienne Balibar proposed a method of critical reading in dialogue with Gilles Deleuze's text, The Method of Dramatization, that approaches the text as a battlefield, he said. We must read a text, he said, as a battlefield, as a space of conflict. And here Skinner is relevant. In part, that was because we were talking about Skinner before that, because the conflict is with other texts, with other people perhaps, but with other texts, rival, adversary, or even intimate enemies, Etienne said. The conflict is within the text, with the text itself. Now, Marx's reading, his way of reading, becomes so important because it was a struggle with these texts, as a battlefield, perhaps, in Etienne's words. And we see questions that were not properly posed, answers that misfired or revealed a different question, subconscious treatments of issues that weren't at the surface. Which is to say, of course, that his reading in this battlefield of Smith and Ricardo's texts invented something like economic science, according to Althusser. Of course, this raises a first set of questions regarding the proximity of our task to those of Balibar and others in 1965. Is there a distinction between the project of reading these texts for present political struggles and the method that we approach the texts with? That is a first set of questions that we're going to need to disentangle, in part because they may have been kind of overly imbricated or confused or meshed, Axel, when we were talking earlier, right? Because there may well be a difference between the if someone could just make sure the lights stay on, that would be great. There may well be a difference between the project of reading these texts and the method that we use. So that's a first set. What is the relation? The second set of questions has to do with the method itself. The method that Althusser develops. He develops a very specific, symptomatic reading method. And I argue in the short introduction that, in fact, he had to develop it in order to distinguish it from a more conventional dialectical approach to reading, which I think would have been more conventional at the time in 1965. But of course, he was trying to extricate Hegel from Marx, and if you're trying to extricate Hegel from Marx, it would be somewhat counterintuitive or productive to turn to Hegel and a Hegelian dialectical method to do that, right? And so in large part, I think that the symptomatic reading method is created as an alternative to a more conventional kind of immanent critique or a conventional notion of internal contradictions. And in that context, that's why I would argue he turns to discourse theory, to Foucault's work, to the history of madness, in his introductory remarks at least, where he writes, for instance, that, quote, "We have evoked the conditions of possibility of the visible and the invisible, of the inside, the outside of the theoretical field that defines the visible," all of which alludes, of course, to this notion of rendering intelligible, in part, discourses that were not intelligible, something, turning something that was an oversight into a sighting. And so the second question will be, what of this symptomatic method today? How can it inform our own approaches to the critical text? Is it unique to reading Marx? Is it necessarily bound or tied down to a scientific interpretation of the text itself? The third question will be the substantive interpretation of Marx and how it can be redeployed, or how maybe the approach itself can be used today. You're familiar, of course, with the general intervention that Althusser was making, trying to create a rupture within Marx's oeuvre, within Marx's work itself, from an earlier humanist approach to a purely scientific approach focused primarily on the theories of surplus value. Althusser refers to this as a break in Marx's words. In his own words, the mutation by which a new science is established in a new problematic separated from the old ideological problematic. And the question for us then is not just what work that move may have made at the time in the mid-1960s. That question would bring us back perhaps too much to Stalinism and the Soviet Union. The question instead is how to read Althusser's choice to push Marx into a scientific direction today. Can it inform our analyses of neoliberalism today? How might it intersect with the digital revolution and the ways in which the economy has been transformed through big data? How might it relate to Judith Revel's argument at Critique 313 on the second sex about the Uberization of the economy, transforming us all into, as she suggested, domestic workers? What might it do to the whole debate over our supposed post-truth era, right? Particularly the push into science that was intended here. So those are some of the extremely difficult and challenging questions that we hope to address. Now, it's, of course, an honor and a treasure for us to have Etienne Balibar here to discuss these questions with us. I know I speak for everyone in the room, all of your colleagues and students and dear friends, when I say that to you, Etienne, that we cherish and treasure having you here with us at Columbia. And we're incredibly grateful for all the time that you spend with us every year, and that we look forward to many, many, many more years together here, thinking together. So, with that, a round of applause for Etienne Balibar.
You make it so nice, so pleasant for me to be here once again with you all. Although, of course, tonight, sitting on the so-called perilous chair or seat, how is it called in King Arthur's mythology, you know? The perilous seat. Because I have to speak to you all and answer Bernard's interpellation. And what I have to say first, I mean, I won't spend much time on that. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Yes. No.
Closer? Okay.
Closer is a problem for me because I don't see my sheets of paper. No, it's okay. It's okay. I don't want to have to shout. So is it fine? Yes. Okay. Thank you. So why is it difficult for me? I could say simply because I happen to have been part, as you so accurately and generously said, of this theoretical adventure a long time ago now. And of course, in a sense, the Balibar who was part of the group around Althusser is a different person. I'm no longer this guy, but I have nevertheless, I'm sure you'll understand, and I've had all my life terrible difficulties in completely distanciating myself from this guy, you know. So that leads to a more objective dimension of the problem, which is that Bernard has insisted several times, and I completely understand his reasons, and I agree with him, on the idea that we don't want to make some sort of archaeological or passeist reading of reading capital, but we want to try and bring the issues to the present, and therefore, of course, in a sense, radically transform, or more or less radically transform what the self-consciousness or the perception of the participants were at the time. But this is not easy for me, so I accept the interpellation, and I hope that the discussion will bring us back to the issues of today. But because of this contradictory situation in which I am myself, when I return to the text, I nevertheless need to understand, and I believe to have to explain to others how I understand what the text, how it was made, and what it meant in its time, you know. Okay. So, thank you for referring to the bibliography. It keeps, of course, growing. In the last few days, I realized, I was informed by people who are here, in fact, or their close friends, that a recent issue of the excellent journal Rethinking Marxism has appeared not long ago, which once again is entirely devoted to Althusser, with the title The Political Encounter with Louis Althusser, edited by Banu Bargou, many of us know her, and Robin Marasco. And I have quickly gone through, and it's absolutely excellent, so I'd ask you to add it to the bibliography. So, okay, thank you. So this bibliography, of course, is monstrous, it is huge. I couldn't do better. And connected to that is, of course, a danger, and once again, I am not apologizing, but I'm expressing my worries and my fears. This could be or remain very esoteric, of course. So if you've had a look at some, and I hope so, of course, at some of the texts that we accepted, and particularly the extracts from Reading Capital, to which you already referred, and I selected essentially 2 passages from Althusser and 1 passage from Rancière. I don't know which feeling you've had. I mean, either you found it impenetrable and unbearable as a kind of philosophical rhetoric that is no longer speaking to us, or you found some enigmatic or perhaps exciting formulas which call for clarification and, if possible, transference or transportation to the present. Okay. So, a few preliminary, I essentially want to address 2 issues, the ones that you alluded to. The question of symptomatic reading, inseparable from, of course, the question of theory, or which sense the category theory had at the time, and a few others with it. And then the question of structure or structuralism, but I want to specifically connect the discussion about structuralism, or part of it, because it's a huge continent, of course, of disputes, to the renewed attention that I want to devote to the chapters on the concept of historical time and the companion chapter, I would say, Marxism, not a historicism, which of course is particularly the one that provoked the violent rejections and reactions that you referred to. To be honest, you have to add that, and you could have added other names, Jean-Paul Sartre, etc. But it also has to be said that there were some defenses of the book at the time, you know. And what's interesting in a sense in those defenses, I will mention but two names, because in my memory these were important events. The first, when Nikos Poulantzas wrote an essay in Les Temps Modernes that was a direct replica or reply to a virulent attack by a Gramsci, a great Gramsci reader and interpreter, and explained that in fact Althusser structuralism was exactly what Marxist theory needed now in order, in particular, and that became of course central issue in the next years, to become able to address, I rephrase it in my terminology from today, but that's what he said, to address the blind spots of Marxist theory in its traditional version, particularly, of course, the question of the superstructures and the state. And then a little later, but that was still part of the same conjuncture, Alain Badiou, who is around these days, or even today he's giving his own seminar in another room in this university, published what's the good term in English for that? Not noisy, but clamorous, I mean resounding praise of Reading Capital, with the title Le recommencement du matérialisme dialectique. And this was, of course, also at the same time a kind of translation or retranslation of what Reading Capital had explained in what was already at the time and remained throughout his life one of his preferred philosophical codes, namely the meta-mathematical language. And this had important consequences, because as a consequence of that, Badiou became a member of the group around Althusser, where he was not at the beginning because he was older and had different. But that was a conversion. He presented it, and everybody saw it as a conversion. I was a Sartrean, now I become an Althusserian, and you may imagine the effect that this had. But of course, in both cases, the continuation in totally different styles were conflicts and very strong divergences, both philosophical and political, in the subsequent years. Now, this already takes me to what I want to be, as quickly as possible, the first preliminary point before I come to symptomatic reading and to multiple temporalities or structural temporality. Don't believe these are pure verbal precautions. This session, which I gladly, of course, agreed to take part in and to play the role of introducer, is not and cannot be a session about the thinking of Althusser. It is more specifically and precisely a session about, and that was your request, that was your demand, about the book, the collective book, in which Althusser, of course, has the dominant part, called Reading Capital. And as time passes, and I've written that in other places. Oh, incidentally, you might ask me, why didn't you put Badiou's article on the bibliography, etc. So I desperately tried to find a translation, but apparently there is not. There is none. There is a chapter in one of Bruno Bosti's books which is explicitly referring and commenting on that, but I didn't find it. Otherwise, of course, I'd put it. This book um, became considered, received as the most typical of what Althusser had to say in that period, in a sense. The structuralist book par excellence, the epistemological book, or the book in which the epistemological bias is pushed to the extreme, and therefore the claim that Marxism ought to be considered as a science in the most intractable, I would say, intractable sense of the term. Otherwise, implicitly, it is bound to dissolve and disappear. And a few other related characteristics, particularly, of course, the idea that this is a terribly dogmatic kind of philosophy. But you can take dogmatic in the sense that is not totally negative. You can take it in the sense of something that is utterly systematic. So if something gave the impression that Althusser was the author and the constructor and the proponent of a system, that was precisely this book. Now, with time passing and a number of texts, posthumous texts being published, and of course the question, why didn't he publish them? That's another question, it's not our object today. Whose amount, quantity, hugely bypasses or the amount of what had been published during his own lifetime, inevitably throws a completely different light on what we knew, I put it simply like that, at the time. And so therefore I will simply summarize it like that. We can return to that if you want, of course. This Althusser is collective, and of course so the name Althusser covers a collective. You said students, and then of course in this collective somebody had the initiative and was the permanent, not only the interlocutor, but the permanent reference. We, the students, would turn to him to seek, I would say, confirmation of our intuitions or support in developing this and that idea. But Althusser was no master in the absolute sense of the term. He had not taken the initiative of constituting the group. The group was constituted because some students at the École Normale who were at the same time actively engaged in communist, para-communist organizations, increasingly, of course, attracted towards Marxism, if only, which is ironic seen from behind, because Jean-Paul Sartre had loudly proclaimed that Marxism was the ultimate and absolute horizon of contemporary thought, of philosophy. So we had a Marxist close to us. Sartre had said, Marxism is the absolute horizon. We came to see Althusser and said, could we do something? Could you help us become Marxists? And it happened that this Marxism was not the same as Sartre's Marxism. But this Marxism, of course, derived from his early writings collected in 4 Marx, published the same year in 65. But it was largely also the result of our own demands and pushes. So these were, in a sense, political, partly political, of course, but they were also, of course, philosophical and particularly epistemological. Epistemological, yes. If you want to have an idea of that, it comes after, but it's nevertheless indicative. You only have to look at the beautiful reprint that has been made at Kingston University of the Cahiers pour l'analyse. So the Cahiers pour l'analyse, of course, were even as strongly and perhaps even more strongly influenced when they finally appeared in '66 by Lacan and to a large extent also by Foucault. But the first issue has a motto, I mean a quotation on the first page from Georges Canguilhem, the professor of Foucault and others at the Sorbonne at the time, and we were all students of Canguilhem, and for us he was the epistemological master. So in a sense what we did, I simplify enormously, but we came to see Althusser and we told him, okay, you know something about Marx, you told us that Canguilhem was the epistemology master, we learned from him, let's now try to combine all that together. And so as a consequence, I don't say that Althusser was reluctant, of course he was not. He was enthusiastic, etc. But we pushed him in a specific direction. And so the book bears all the traces of that. So therefore, it's not pure and simply the continuation of what Althusser had begun. It has, of course, important elements that come from his early texts, particularly on contradiction and over-determination, the idea of a non-Hegelian or even anti-Hegelian concept of the dialectics. And the whole question of the structural temporality certainly derives from there, and I'll return to this. But it is not pure and simply the continuation of that. And in a sense, I come to this in a minute, what became known as théoricisme, theoreticism or theoricism, which is the target of Rancière's attack against his previous fellow friends. In a sense, because probably if you have a look at that, Rancière's contribution to writing Capital goes really to the extreme in developing a theoreticist point of view. This theoreticism or théoricisme, I'm not sure about the English for that. Theoreticism or theorism? French is fine, yes, because in English it sounds very badly. In French as well. I mean, so this is not something that was foreign to Althusser, but it is something that our collaboration with him considerably reinforced and pushed towards. And of course, after that, you have other Althussers. You have a series of self-criticisms. You have a brutal shift from theoreticism to a kind of politicism, which is linked to the post-68 conjuncture. And you have the now extremely famous latent or hidden Althusser, the one who for himself, particularly during the 70s, was developing a kind of alternative philosophical point of view, which has become known as aleatory materialism today, largely based on unpublished material at the time, among which I single out, because I think this is an absolute masterwork of reading, once again, and philosophical interpretation, the book on Machiavelli. Why didn't he publish the book on Machiavelli? Great question. And so you could even make that a little more complicated. This is by suggesting that these are not only temporal oscillations. This would be a historicist interpretation in a sense. That is, the conjuncture changes. Before 68, this is the era of the triumph or the emergence of structuralism. Everybody wants to be structuralist. Foucault wants to be structuralist. He denied it after that, but okay, forgive me. He wrote a masterpiece of structuralist or quasi-structuralist philosophy, which is the order of things, and other texts as well. So Althusser also and his students are doing the same. After which 68 arrives, the intellectual landscape is totally transformed, overwhelmed. There's one single motto: back to practice, back to politics, back to actual commitment, participation in the struggles, etc., and anathema on structuralism and theoreticism. And of course, Althusser would also, it's not entirely false, I mean, bend to that new circumstance, and that would continue. I'm not totally satisfied with that representation because I believe, and in this respect, I agree with, they are in the bibliography with what I consider to be two of the most interesting recent, there are others, but recent systematic accounts of Althusser's thinking. Warren Montag's book called Althusser and His Contemporaries, and Emilio de Hippola's extraordinary little book, Althusser El Infinito Adios, The Infinite Farewell, which has been recently translated into English. They both defend, in somewhat different terms, the idea that, in fact, Althusser is permanently, in fact, thinking along, I would say, different paths, on different roads, perhaps within different problematics, so they have intersections or interference. Is he a theoretical split personality? That's the question you cannot avoid asking. And I'm not bringing in all the pathetic elements that you know I could bring in. So that's so now quickly come to reading capital. Another thing that has to be said, and I've already said it in a sense, has to do with the composition in both senses of that text. How was it composed? How is it composed? Of what is it composed? So, several contributions with the preface from which you read something, of course, written afterwards, after the event. If you read that preface carefully, you will see that, as very frequently in Althusser, it has a kind of, I find it a beautiful text, I have to admit, not always the case when I reread Althusser's text. It has an extraordinary momentum, movement. It reinterprets, of course, it's a kind of reappropriation. I've described the whole thing as a collective work in which we, in a sense, had pushed him somewhere where he perhaps wouldn't have gone alone. But of course, the preface is the moment when he reappropriates all that. And he reappropriates all that in his own terms. And they are very well worth, of course, discussing, but there are 2 points which I want to emphasize. The one, and I'll return to that, you're absolutely right to emphasize the importance of the passage where explicit allusions and direct quotations are made of Foucault's discourse and ideas. The question of the visible and the invisible, or the idea that there is no possibility of creating, I would say, installing phenomenologically or scientifically something like a space of visibility without that space of visibility involving or including invisible causes or dimensions or elements. And of course that came directly from Foucault's Histoire de la Folie and remained an important theme in Foucault's later writings. I'm not settling accounts with Foucault retrospectively, but when Foucault repeatedly explained in later interviews that Histoire de la Folie had been met with absolute silence, nobody had spoken about it, I don't believe my own eyes. Because I remember that as soon as Histoire de la Folie had been published, there were 2 important philosophical figures in Paris who immediately explained to their own students, Georges Canguilhem at the Sorbonne and Louis Althusser at the École Normale Supérieure, that this book was the most important book of philosophy or in the field of philosophy that had been written since something very important, whatever. So that it was a turning point. Now, what we know now, I hope I'm not bothering you with that. what we know now, owing to the work, of course, the archival and interpretative work of young Foucault scholars, they began with Foucault most of the time, who are reading the archives and the Foucault archives, and especially Foucault's early writings, early manuscripts. What they are discovering is that for a period of several years, that is in the early and mid-50s, Althusser and Foucault, together with the third man, the one to whom For Marx is dedicated, Jacques Martin, who has no work, worked together as a community of thought and probably also inspiration and interest, which has very few equivalents in the history of philosophy. So perhaps I'm grandizing that a little bit because, again, I'm a little part of that, although I knew nothing of that past at the time, so I may have a tendency to transform it into a myth. But to me, it's something very similar to the Hegel, Hölderlin, Schelling community at Tübingen, at the Tübingen Stift. So they write texts together, almost. And the discoveries that Jean-Baptiste Suivreau has made is the expression coupure épistémologique appears apparently for the first time not under Althusser's pen but under Foucault's pen. The category historical a priori that becomes central in the order of things is their common elaboration. And so, of course, for the category of problématique or problematic, which of course after that they will pull in slightly different directions, which I simplify enormously among other sources, but centrally comes from the common reading of Heidegger. I'm intimately convinced that Foucault, Althusser, and Jacques Martin in the early 50s were reading Heidegger, perhaps not on the same copy of the book, but in the same room, and etc. etc. So that's so this is one of the reasons why this passage in the preface is so interesting. I agree with you. And another remark that has to be made is that if you go to the end of the preface, in a sense, I mean, like so many of Althusser's texts, the Machiavelli book, etc., it ends nowhere, apparently. I mean, no, or it remains suspended. It's not that it ends nowhere, but it remains suspended. And it remains suspended in a very strange manner on an extremely interesting formula, which I'm sure has present relevance because it contains implicitly a radical critique or radical criticism of every sociological theory or sociological method which works with such categories as society, community, etc., as if these were, if you like, essences or simply facts or givens. The phrase at the end of the preface, or almost the last phrase, is what now we have been investigating the so-called effet de connaissance, knowledge effect, which was another name for epistemological break, inventing a science of a new type, etc. What remains now to be done is investigating the society effect, l'effet de société. But what I believe, and I'll try and illustrate that, is that there is no need, in fact, to imagine that something is missing that would be the elaboration of the effet de société. Because in fact, reading Capital, and especially the chapters on temporality and structure, have no other object than understanding what an effet de société exactly means. Now then came another problem, which was the problem of the publication, therefore reception, you already alluded to that, and republications. And I'm not here, of course, to explain how guilty I feel. This is not interesting. But still, something has to be said. You now have to, in your hands, what Bernard Harcourt presented as the complete edition. This complete edition, I had to struggle with Verso because they didn't want to, they wanted to complete, of course, the existing edition, because in the meantime, the French republication of the whole volume had come out, but didn't want to do what I was asking them to do, which is put back the existing text in the order, in the original, in the initial order. They thought it would be cheaper and easier, in a sense, to first republish the existing translation. And the existing translation, as you perhaps know, and etc., consisted only of Althusser's preface, Althusser's huge contribution, of course, within the book, the object of Marx's Capital, and my own contribution on the theory of modes of production, fundamental concepts of historical materialism, which I had copied on Kant's fundamental concepts of physics. Why did that, and this is part of the clash with Rancière, of course. Rancière would not admit, and I would not suggest, that his reasons to attack reading Capital retrospectively as a whole, the whole enterprise, and the Althusserian position came from the fact that the book had been republished, eliminating his contribution. Still, try and imagine that situation. And so the reasons at the time were extremely bad reasons of the kind. The edition of reference is the complete edition. But, of course, that for the sake of militant use, used by practitioners of anthropology, sociologists who are now going to Africa to study the local modes of production, etc. What they need is something that is reduced, that is more pedagogic, that is not this unreadable massive thing. So Althusser said to us, there are two solutions. And he addressed us as a collective. There are two possibilities. Either each of us make cuts in his, no woman in that group, to his make cuts in his contribution, and we get to a reduced version. Or we select some of the contributions for the so-called édition de poche. This will not be the edition of reference. So what do you prefer? We said, you choose. We are not going to decide, etc. At this moment, the master was the master again, if you like. And Althusser said, I remember that. Althusser said, I think that the best solution is to keep only my text; they cannot be eliminated, and Balibar. Why? Because Balibar is very pedagogic. He clarifies the meaning of the concepts, whereas Macheret's very quick contribution, his great contribution to the whole enterprise, were his contemporary writings on literary production. They arise from the same problematic. They are important, and Establé had added a kind of postscriptum to the whole book. And for what concerns Rancière, this is extremely important. This is very sophisticated theory. But for that, precisely for that reason, it's not easy to read. We said, okay, and I spent 40 years of my life, or 50 years of my life, asking myself why I had accepted that, whose consequence was that all the foreign translations were made, first the Italian, then the English, or the reverse order, and then in every possible language in the world after the so-called reduced working edition, leaving aside, etc. Now let me come to Rancière's critique. I believe that Rancière's critique, so don't rush to psychological interpretation, or rush to psychological interpretation, if you like. I, of course, put his text. Incidentally, I want to say something here. Again, the bibliography was not so easy to make because Rancière has written several times on Althusser. So the texts that are best known are first the article that he wrote, postscriptum to a reading of Reading Capital, already a reading of the reading, in which he explains why this project is completely unacceptable, both from the philosophical and the political point of view. And I think I could summarize that by saying it's not a critique. It's not a critique. Then he wrote, of course, Althusser's Lesson, which he denies being a Maoist book pushed or made possible by, being part of the big conflict. I allude to that in my preface to the Chinese edition. The big conflict between Althusser and his former students when he remained in the Communist Party and they moved to the Maoist tendency already before and after 68. But he has written, and Althusser's Lesson is not only it's not uninteresting, but it's not a bad book. Rancière is remarkably gifted, especially for polemic, but his polemic is substantial. I once said to him, "You are a genius of nastiness." So he didn't like it because he has an extraordinary capacity to reverse from the inside the meaning of, which is a kind of symptomatic reading. And in fact, that I believe that Rancière has kept a lot from the idea of symptomatic reading. And the visible and the invisible is at the very heart of what he calls the partage du sensible. So in a sense, he's inherited something. But of course, he's broken with something. And then he has also written other texts. There is one which I like particularly. I think it's a brilliant text. Again, it's nasty, but it has a lot of intuition, called La Scène du Texte. I might return to that. It's on symptomatic reading, but there is no English translation. If you read French, have a look at that. Now, Rancière's critique was, Reading Capital is a pure example of theoreticism. So what can theoreticism mean? Theoreticism means something, of course, in opposition to other terms. And I can think of three of them, but I will concentrate on only one. The first I must think of is, of course, historicism. Theoreticism is the absolute opposite of historicism. This is Thompson's critique, and it largely relies on the question whether and how, to what extent Althusser was right in trying to distantiate himself as much as possible from Gramsci's so-called absolute historicism. But the question remains of what absolute historicism meant in Gramsci. Althusser read that, I simplify, as the perfect evidence of the fact that despite all his inventions and originality and his other sources of inspiration, in the end, Gramsci had returned to pure Hegelianism, because absolute historicism was understood by Althusser as meaning that history and philosophy united, combined together, mirroring each other in a kind of reciprocity, recreate something like the Hegelian spirit. This is probably not what Gramsci meant by that idea. And here I have no difficulty in admitting that Thompson is closer to the truth, because Thompson's problem is the making of the working class, as you said, and Gramsci's interest was in historicizing historicizing not only the categories of political economy, but the question of the articulation of class, party, and organization or strategy, I would say, and political strategy. This has to be an object of historical investigation as well. And of course, now that we are living the consequences of the decaying of the party form, we find we not always agree, and we might want to look into other directions. But the fact that Gramsci had begun this inquiry on the history, not as Thompson, of the making of the working class, but of the making of the political party as an institution and as an agent or as a subject of political action, becomes every day ever more meaningful and important. And therefore, turning towards Althusser, we may suspect here, and I'll try and return to this in a minute, that this is a very symptomatic blind spot in Althusser. By rejecting historicism, he wants to do many different things, and particularly that takes him close to Benjamin, of course, get rid of evolutionist and progressivist representations of history, but he also covers the question of the causes or the forms in which a party represents a class, something that he takes for granted because he's a member of the Communist Party. You might want to say that. Now, there's another aspect, of course, of the opposition between theoreticism and historicism, which has to do with, that's the structuralist category par excellence, with the idea that structuralist attitude tries to construct, I would say, to construct invariance. And that, of course, provoked the furor of the people you were alluding to, the great minds that you were alluding to in a moment. What? Invariance? I mean, Marxism is entirely about getting rid of invariance. This is because they immediately understood invariant as essence. Their essence is fixed structures, if you like. But if you're a good structuralist, you understand this in a different manner, and the discussion has continued. The invariant is what makes it possible to think of variations. And I believe that was... So another antithesis would be activism. And activism is a very interesting word because it, in English it has connotations that it doesn't have in French. Okay. Leave that aside. And third, the one that Rancière attacked, and I think he hit the target on an important point, because Rancière's target was the idea that theory, as understood by the Althusserians, and behind the Althusserians were the great representatives of the French epistemological tradition. Am I clear? Yes? Yeah. That is Bachelard in particular, even more than Canguilhem, is a pedagogism. This is closely linked to the idea that the essential function of science, of theory as science, and here the equivalence of the two terms becomes extremely implicit, is the instance, I would say, or the agency, if you prefer, in human history or in civilization, that makes it possible to teach the ignorance what they don't know, and to teach or to bring to the practitioners, I would say, the people of the practice, be it political or otherwise, the foundations, and therefore the rationale for their own actions in order to improve it. Now, of course, this is not purely a question of Althusser's theoreticism. Behind Althusser, the famous reference to Kautsky's and Lenin's phrases on theory needing to be introduced from the outside into the labor movement in order to extract the labor movement from its own spontaneity and therefore empiricism, blah, blah, blah. All that is there. or that is there. I cannot think of that without remembering the great motto of German social democracy that was, in a sense, continued by every Marxist organization after them: studieren, propagandieren, organisieren. First, that says everything. But the more I think about that, the more I realize, and this is very deep, that in a sense the notion of theory in the Western philosophical tradition, and that traces back to Plato, that traces back to Aristotle, is hardly separable, and comes to Husserl and to modern theorists, is hardly separable from the notion of mathesis. And etymologically, mathesis means precisely teaching, learning and teaching. So the idea, what Rancière hits or touches is the question whether, from a Marxist, the difficulty whether from a Marxist point of view or a revolutionary point of view, if you like, the theory that the movement needs is a pedagogy, and how could it not be a pedagogy? Now, of course, Rancière's later attitude or position, as you know, went to the absolute antithesis of that, the ignorant master. And everybody knows that book, which is a great book of philosophy. But again, I simplify enormously. We don't want any pedagogy. The proletarians, the worker, are not calling for intellectuals to teach them what to do and what to know about the situation in which they are. If a critique or a criticism is immanent in their action, it is something that they will invent themselves, or that they will create themselves, or that will emerge from the antagonism or latent and explicit antagonism with existing conditions of life, and not something which will call for the detour of theory, as Gregory Eliot beautifully wrote in his book on Althusser. But the question, of course, I keep asking myself is whether the only choice we have, if you like, the only choice we have is between a pedagogic understanding of theory and the ignorant master. That's put it like that. And so the very, very tentative hypothesis that I was thinking of for today was, let's try and play the game, the philosophical game of radical, of pushing to the extremes, pushing the conflict, the contradiction to the extreme. Just as Althusser had not really understood what absolute historicism would mean in the case of Gramsci, which was not pure and simply the standard historicism or progressivism of the Marxist tradition that Benjamin again attacked, or also in the same period. Probably the Gramscian readers, or the readers of Gramsci, or the defensors of historicism and the violent critiques of theoreticism would not completely understand what something I dare to call absolute theoreticism could involve. And absolute theoreticism is not just the idea that you need theory, that you have to bring in theory in order to do politics. Now, let's, I'll skip a number of intermediaries because I wouldn't, that would be, I don't have time. That will come back perhaps in the discussion about the meanings of theory and the meanings of science, which evolved. Of course, reading capital was not the last word of Althusser on this question, and as is well known, and that takes us relatively close to the question of absolute theoreticism. Very soon, Althusser agreed, in an apparently defensive move, to rectify or to modify the chronological representation of the epistemological break to which you alluded a moment ago, which had made him famous. All the controversy were about that. Is Althusser right or not to explain that before a certain date, 1845, Marx was a Hegelian, Feuerbachian humanist, humanist philosopher. And after 1845, he had become the inventor of that new science, nuova scienza, that new science, not of political economy, but of historical materialism, which within itself includes, of course, as a prerequisite, a critique of political economy, which, in a sense, of course, joined the standard formulas in the Marxist or Leninist tradition. Interestingly, already at this time, that's the symptomatic reading of Althusser. There was a category there in the middle to account for the fact that the break could not be as clean as that. This category, which I find increasingly interesting, is the category of practical concepts. It turns towards the German ideology and the Communist Manifesto and the thesis on Feuerbach, and he says there you have concepts. They are no longer really Hegelian. They are also not yet the categories, the scientific categories of capital. So what are they? They are the contradiction as such, of course. They are the embodied contradiction. They are first a continuous, a permanent mixture of philosophical and scientific, if you like, inspiration. And second, they are intrinsically contradictory. And for that reason, they are mobile. They are mobile. That was a great idea. If he had read Jameson's Vanishing Mediator essay, he would have called it like that. But of course, after that, he came to another idea whose name was inspired, because he was a French professor of philosophy, by the reading of Descartes. Descartes famously had explained that God created the world not in a single moment, but over time. La création continuée. I don't know what the standard translation for that is. The protracted creation, or the continuous creation. So Althusser proposed the idea, somewhat later, that the coupure épistémologique, the epistemological break, was not a chronological break between two periods, which is horribly empiricist and historicist, if you think about it. Of course, it's one way of using the idea of the linearity of time. But is a conflict, is an intrinsic conflict that keeps going, changes perhaps objects, and never ends, never ends. Therefore, of course, you keep the idea, absolute theoreticism, that there is a radical incompatibility between two types of discourse. But this radical incompatibility is not to be looked for in the fact that certain texts belong entirely or almost entirely to one problematic and other texts belong entirely to the other problematic. It is a break, it is an internal conflict without possible conciliation. Not everybody would agree with that, of course, which is intrinsic or internal to the later moments of theory as well, and particularly capital, of course, capital. Okay, so give me a few more minutes if you agree. Let me come to symptomatic reading and temporality. So, I already said something about that, which I won't repeat. Harcourt asked, isn't this notion of symptomatic reading the very place where Althusser comes extremely close to Foucault? And I said yes. But this is probably not the whole story. Another possibility, which I do not develop, etc., would be to explain that Althusser comes close to Derrida. If you read together, not just reading Capital, and especially the preface, and Foucault's Histoire de la Folie or other texts, but Althusser's text and Derrida's Grammatology, there are amazing convergences as well. So the exchanges were equally important and meaningful. One of the reasons why I mentioned that, I hope my anecdotes are not bothering you and don't seem to you to be completely out of the question, is the fact that if we returned for a minute to the what I call the composition of the book and the circumstances in which it was elaborated. The seminar we had, or the working group that we had set up with Althusser, began in '61 with a seminar on the young Marx. It continued in '62 with a seminar on origins of structuralism, which discussed Lévi-Strauss' predecessors and Foucault most centrally. It went on in '63 with a seminar entirely devoted to Lacan's reading of Freud, and finally in '64, 65, it became what we had been, in a sense, preparing ourselves for, because Althusser, and I think he was right, thought that that was the kernel of the Marxist fortress. That is the reading of Capital, and the injunction to all sorts of Marxists, whether breakaway opponents or orthodox members of the communist parties, to return to Capital and read it in a non-economicist way, which he described as philosophical. You cannot imagine the efforts he was doing in the subsequent years to have either these texts or other similar texts published in the socialist countries. That was his absolute obsession. Never succeeded except in one case, which is very strange, Hungary. But I leave that aside. So the thing I want to refer to is the strange fact that this year, academic year, 64-65, two seminars were organized at the École Normale Supérieure in philosophy. One was Althusser's seminar on Marx, that we jointly organized. It was a collective endeavor. And the other one was Derrida's seminar on Heidegger and the question of being and history, which is now published posthumously and translated into English, of course, by Jeff Bennington, and who claims that his version is better than the French, so which perhaps is true. Now, when Derrida's editors started to work on this seminar by Derrida, they contacted me and they said to me, you must have some memories from that seminar. Could you help us feed the footnotes, clarify some allusions in Derrida's text? And I said to them, but I have absolutely no memory of that seminar. They said, but it was in 64-65. You were at the École Normale Supérieure. I said, I had no memory of that. So I reconstructed the whole thing. What appears here is what? So I have to accelerate. Can I? Yes.
Hold on for a second.
Yes.
Are we all okay? Everything okay? Everything okay?
So let's not be disturbed. It was not a boycott, which maybe Derrida was a little paranoiac sometimes, so he may have thought that. It was just the fact that the Althusserian group was so completely obsessed with its interest for Marx's the confrontation between Marx and Hegel, which is the object, one of the main objects of the seminar, that we didn't thought we had time to go listen what Derrida, whom we admired, he had been our professor as well, was doing on what? On Heidegger and Hegel. That is another confrontation, symmetric. So what would have arisen if we had followed the two seminars? Nobody knows. But that Althusser knew what Derrida was doing there, that they may have discussed various things, that I now don't doubt. Now we come to the question which is central in Harcourt's interrogation or interpellation of reading as method. The more I think of that, the less I like the expression reading as method. But you are not the culprit, because of course it's in Althusser's text. So I think that a better formulation is reading as practice, meaning there are no rules. There are no rules. There are no pre-established rules. But of course there is a model. There's a model. This model, or and this model is Freud. There's no doubt about that. So what derives from that model, and I think we agree on that, you explained this very clearly, is that the essence of the practice of symptomatic reading is a comparison, is a material comparison between texts. So you do not read a single text in a symptomatic manner. You can produce symptomatic reading only if you compare texts. But now, of course, they are different, and you compare texts in order to identify what are symptoms in a sense rather similar, of course, of what Freud called symptoms in the interpretation of dreams or the psychoanalysis of everyday life, the Wits, and so on, and so on, namely contradictions, if you like, conflicts, but essentially discrepancies, décalage, not gaps, non-correspondences between things which are supposed to be complementary. And the things that are supposed to be complementary in the example that he takes are the questions asked by which are expressed as such in one text, and the answers provided that are there in the other text. This is the discrepancy that you try and identify. And of course there are two cases which are possible, and it seems that Althusser practices both in his text. The first case is when the texts are separated according to what? According to what Foucault a little later, or etc., would call the other principle. That one is written by Ricardo, the other one is written by Marx. Marx answers the question that Ricardo does not formulate, but that was latent in his theory. And you have a reciprocal view. And the other case, of course, is the case in which the two texts that you compare are texts written by the same author and belonging apparently to the same discourse, within which you disentangle antithetic problematics whose relationship can only be of the order, I would say, of suppression or silencing. One text silencing another one. I finish on that by I return to this question with the following. Is that okay? Is that yes? Following remark. Suppose you have in mind this question of the symptomatic reading, which is our question. So you cannot ask only the question, how do you practice symptomatic reading? But you must ask the question, what are you reading? What are you reading? Symptomatic reading of what? And the comparison to Freud is, of course, especially illuminating and also puzzling in this respect. So I would say that there are three successive possible answers, and each one is worth looking at. First, of course, that's what I have just suggested. You read a text, or you read texts, text in the usual sense of the term. Immediate next question: is every text a possible object for such a reading? And in Althusser here again there's a symptom, very interesting symptom, which has to do with the question of art, or the question of literature. At the center of for Marx, but not Reading Capital, this disappears in Reading Capital. It's a fascinating text which many of us has commented again and again on theater, Bertolazzi and Brecht. I wrote this article, Althusser's Dramaturgy, and others have written on that too, and we had a discussion, so I won't repeat the description, etc. But Althusser's interpretation, if you like, and this is of course where you begin to ask yourself if the distinction between the idea of symptomatic reading and the hermeneutic traditions. You were absolutely right. This is not a dialectical method, but there are other hermeneutic traditions. So in a sense, Althusser is creating his own hermeneutic practice. But I push brutally to the conclusion. I tend to believe that literary texts, artistic performances, or some of them, he would never say art in general, was not interested in that, but he believed to have found example, embody a critical power that in a sense they teach themselves to us, and which is not exactly the object of a symptomatic reading in the sense that I was describing. Second possibility, what you read is a generalized text. That's where we come close to Derrida, of course. Anything that can be thought or imagined, and here possibly writing would be a better category than text, that can be conceived as writing in the broad sense of the term, calls for a symptomatic reading. But the most interesting idea that you find in Marx more than in Reading Capital is the idea that you read something that is a non-text. That is not a. So that seems to be a contradiction in terms, and I believe that this contradiction is very productive and very interesting, because the next question becomes: what is it that you can read or that you must read in something, a historical situation, a political event or process, etc., that essentially is not a text, or exceeds every textuality. And my answer in a simple manner that would call for a whole discussion, and maybe you can return to that, is that Althusser's implicit and even explicit answer was always the same. What calls for reading, or for symptomatic reading, and in that sense interpretation or critical interpretation within an objectivity or another field of objectivity that is not purely textual, is the ideology. Is the ideological discourse, or perhaps better, the ideological relationship, the double relationship that Althusser always described in the same terms. That is, allusion or reference, if you prefer, in other terms, to the materiality of that situation, and illusion or displacement, representation, imaginary displacement. Now, I tend to believe, this is, of course, I'm pleading for my own saint because I wrote that article. I believe that Althusser practiced a method of symptomatic reading, which is very much there already in the passages of Reading Capital, but latent. And Rancière, in his text, La scène du texte, extricated that. he said rightly so, Althusser is catastrophic because he's permanently imagining dramatic scenes. He stages ideological situations where he attributes voices or textual voices to the various antithetic positions, and particularly, of course, the ideology or the pure ideology on one side and the theory on the other side. I tend to use this idea not in a negative manner, but in a positive manner. That is, I try, that's my own interpretation today, to move from Althusser's first presentation while remaining in the same spirit to the idea that the symptomatic reading is the reading that makes it possible to listen to the multiplicity of incompatible voices that are there in a text or a situation, or more generally in ideology. Of course, there's a little bit of Bakhtin in what I'm saying now, but it leads to the, I believe, interesting hypothesis that reading ultimately means listening. Which is, of course, something. And finally, on the question of structure and historical time. So, do you allow me?
Yes.
Yes, quickly. So, these are the chapters 4 and 5. It's important to read them together. It's important, and I put this very bluntly in the following manner. It's important to read them together because you have the best and the worst of Althusser at this time. The chapter on historical time is the best, relatively. I don't say it's excellent, but it's the best, relatively. The chapter on Marxism as historicism is the worst. So that's not what we thought at the time. So I have to qualify that, of course. The chapter on Marxism and historicism is very interesting in many respects. It's particularly interesting for its, in fact, not even virtual, symptomatic reading of Gramsci, which will be continued later in other Althusserian texts, which obeys the same law, of course, which you are not forced to accept that. The idea that Gramsci asks certain questions for which he provides inadequate answers that have to be replaced. And of course, ultimately, this would lead to what? To incorporating a kind of transformed Gramsci or reinterpreted Gramsci into the critical theory. But the worst is his way of explaining. He also corrected that later, but very late and very tentatively in the article, and very implicitly in the article on Marx and Freud from '76 that I also put in the bibliography. It's the idea that historicism has two varieties. One is leftist. This is Lukács. One is rightist, the common critique against Gramsci at the time in, I would say, orthodox communist parties. So therefore, and these two deviations, that's the category that he uses, these two deviations have exactly the same root, which is their deep Hegelianism. Though I don't return to the discussion of Gramsci's alleged Hegelianism, but or historicism according to a Hegelian model, which of course is not the same in Lukács exactly and in Gramsci, but this certainly both have Hegelian roots. Now, why do I say that this is the worst? This is the worst because it is the exact technique that Stalin used and the Stalinian orthodoxy used in order to eliminate its oppositions from the left and from the right. Now, of course, Althusser is not eliminating anybody, he's just criticizing theoretical discourse. But he uses this exact scheme. What apparently is taking Marxist theory, and here you have to say Marxist orthodoxy, into antithetic directions, in fact, express exactly the same misunderstanding or mistake with respect to the theory. Now, of course, Stalin did not invent that. It has roots in Lenin himself, especially in the period of the controversy with left communism and so on and so on. But Stalin transformed it into an institution. So here Althusser, like it or not, is a Stalinian. However interesting the details of his readings can be, and the points he raises. But the other, of course, chapter, and there are overlappings between both, is of a totally different nature. So here again, preliminaries would be needed, but we don't have time. The first, Althusser continuously insists, that's the guiding thread, on the idea which has been reproached. In a sense, some people have found that bizarre. What a strange idea, that there is no Hegelian politics. The idea that there is no Hegelian politics does not mean that Hegel didn't have politics. He had several, he evolved, etc. You might want to say, but you have to qualify it, as we know, that his politics was the construction or the defense of the Prussian state, although with liberal orientations. But what Althusser wants to say here is that, and it's a kind of symptomatic reading as well, is that you cannot account for Hegel's actual politics on Hegelian terms. And that's very interesting because it is, in a sense, a reversal of what Marx himself had explained in the 43 manuscript, which Althusser, we know now, had not only carefully read, but almost identified with. The second preliminary remark, this is very dear to me, very important to me, is that Althusser knew nothing, that I know, and I have found no trace. Maybe some scholar will find counterexamples, but Althusser knew nothing of the contemporary or the 20th century Marxists whose formulations seem to remarkably dovetail with his theory or his concept of multiple temporalities within the same present. These are, of course, Benjamin's idea of constellations of past, present, and future events, which makes it possible for him to eliminate, to get rid of what he calls historicism, which is essentially evolutionism, and above all, of course, Ernst Bloch's notion of the non-contemporaneity of the present, which is literally the same formula as Althusser, almost literally the same formula as Althusser, applied by Bloch, as we know, in his immediate pre-war remarkable attempt at understanding the causes and the structure of the advent, the coming to power of the National Socialist Party. It's not. I have problems in thinking that Althusser knew nothing of that. It had been translated already, and in any case, Althusser read German, but he probably had would have thought that this was a kind of cultural history that didn't, that in fact left aside the infrastructure. In any case, all that also comes from Marx. It comes from the amazing sentence in Marx's introduction to the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right in 1844, where Marx, about Germany precisely, says what is striking in the case of Germany compared to other European countries, Britain, France, etc., is the fact that in the German situation we have at the same time something that remains part of the Vorgeschichte, the prehistory of modernity, and something that anticipates an overcoming of that modernity, which he calls Nachgeschichte, post-history, leading to etc. So several people, of course, have written on that. Peter Osborne is very interesting because he compares Althusser to Bloch and others on specifically the issue of non-contemporaneity. So he did not know that, and nevertheless he came relatively close, at least in some of his formulations. But as I already explained, he knew Heidegger, and therefore there is a latent influence or derivation of the Heideggerian notion of the complex, or the Zusammenhang, the combination of different temporal ecstasies in Althusser's elaboration. And above all, of course, he was relying on a specifically or typically French, which you might want to call objectivist in a sense, array of references, which the others, of course, the Frankfurt School, the Benjaminian and Blochian Marxist, etc., completely ignored. What was that? That was Brodel, I don't insist on that, with some important rectifications. That was Lévi-Strauss. That was Lévi-Strauss. If you read again the famous little text, very importantly, Race and History, you find there explicitly the following idea under Lévi-Strauss' pen: each culture, which each culture's time or mode of historicity is invisible for its others. And that is repeated literally in Althusser's text. The different temporality are essentially characterized, their heterogeneity is characterized by this phenomenological more than ontological characteristic, which is they are immediately invisible for one another. And behind that are other sources, particularly Marcel Mauss' extraordinary essay on the season variations of Eskimo societies, variations saisonnières des sociétés Eskimo, where he explains that the Kwakiut culture, the cultures of British Columbia, are based on the fact that they live, in fact, not in one single, but in two different times. Now, last thing I want to say about that, and I know I've been much too long, is how to interpret the change in the title of the chapter. I increasingly find this interesting. The first title was the concept of history in Marx. Mistakes of the Marxian critique of political economy, meaning the idea that to criticize political economy means to bring in time. Where the political economists saw things as immobile, natural, perpetual, invariant, blah, blah, you have to historicize. That's what Althusser rejects. But the first title is the concept of historical time, the concept of history. And in the second edition, the one, the infamous one where some participants are eliminated, he makes some changes. And an important change is to shift to the idea, to the concept of historical time. That is a more ontological formulation. It's even a formulation that you may want to pull towards a kind of Heideggerian notion of ontological difference. The concept of historical time or temporality is to the concept of history, or the variation of history, as being is to, with capital B, is to beings with a single B. Perhaps a discussion with Derrida would have played a role. But that leads to the possibility of two different readings and two different understandings of the notion of structure. The first reading, the one that of course was dominant for a long time, the one that I applied in my contribution and later texts, etc., of course, relies on the idea that there is a structure. This structure of what? Structure of the mode of production, structure of the social formation, structure of what Althusser calls the totality. The social totality, and he derives that from Marx's 1857 introduction. And then, of course, you face a dilemma. Either you go with Hegel, the totality of course is multifaceted, blah blah, but it is supposed to express the logic of one single central principle, a zeitgeist that is at the same time a Volksgeist, and in fact an expression of the Weltgeist, and from there you derive a certain idea or a certain representation of the time of history or time in history, which is as dialectical as you want, but remains fundamentally linear, of course, linear, or you bring in another notion of the structure of in the descriptive sense, or even if it's abstract, of the social totality, which Althusser never tired of describing as complex, characterized by complexity, unevenness, and therefore absolutely irreducible to the expression of one single principle, from which, of course, you derive another idea of time. So you have a kind of double proportion, and it's explicit in the text. To the Hegelian totality conceived as an expressive whole does correspond a concept of linear time, which of course from a dialectical point of view is not just external but is permanent, is made of permanent interiorization of its own acquisition. From the Marxian totality or the Marxian structure characterized by complexity and in fact heterogeneity, you derive a representation of the historical time, a phenomenology, if you like, of the historical time, where the important element, of course, is discrepancy, non-contemporaneity, what Daniel Ben Saïd, a reader of Benjamin, in perfect French, called la discordance des temps, the discrepancy of times. But there is another possible reading which is much more immanent and I believe is also more dialectical, although perhaps, I mean, that's where the comparison with Hegel becomes again interesting, which is that the structure does not precede. The structure does not pre-exist the emergence of different times. What we call the structure is nothing other than a complexity, an articulation of different temporalities. And here, of course, the concept of structure can be relied or articulated with the notion of invariant, but that's good structuralism. It's an invariant that immediately calls for the permanent variation of its internal disposition. So this means that the structure describes, exhibits, extricate the multiplicity, the heterogeneity, the divergences, the conjunctural fusion of different temporalities. And then that's my last remark. So you will ask yourself, why call that temporality? Why not call that practices? For example, as Althusser himself did in several places, and others as well. I believe that here we can take advantage from the translation problem. Because as, again, I repeat, that comes from Freud, or that comes from a certain critical use of Freud. And the term in Freud is instance. But when so there are different instances, there are two topographies, etc. But clearly in Freud it's like that. The time of the unconscious is not the same as the time of consciousness. But when the English readers had to translate, they faced a problem because instance in English is not very common, and so the first the Strachey edition chose agency, which has no good equivalent in French, or you had to introduce agence, because which eliminates the subject, or better said, includes the question of the construction of the subject of action within the description and explanation of the action itself. That is the subject, or something like, or the pseudo-subject, or the quasi-subject, organized or spontaneous of any historical action, is not something or something or some person, imaginary person that preceded. The working class decides to adopt a revolutionary strategy, but of course it's the effect of the practice itself. Now, I would suggest that you can read Althusser's chapter like that. The temporalities are agencies which produce and determine their own agents, which are not exactly subjects, but which are quasi-subject. And here I would very much like to retrieve something from Lukács, because subject-object is not a bad name. So something has been missed here, perhaps by Althusser. And I think that this is extremely useful and productive. Finally, I come to you in the present. This is extremely productive and interesting in the present. Why? Because Althusser's problem, as we know, was a political problem. And in this sense, at the time at least, he was very much a member of a communist party in the West, etc., competing or struggling with others. His problem was the leap into the revolutionary situation from within a multiplicity or heterogeneity, I would say a disjunctive, that's a Deleuzian formula, a disjunctive social structure made of tendencies, counter-tendencies, primary and secondary contradictions in Mao's terms, etc., etc. So the problem was the equivalent, the materialist or the Marxist equivalent of the idea of the revolutionary kairos, the moment of break or rupture. But paradoxically, I cannot help when I read that today like that, just like in Christianity, the Messiah has already arrived once. We know that, the Gospel tells the story, but remains to come. So for Althusser and many other Marxists, the revolutionary event had already taken place. That was 1917. But the problem was now how to have it come back, how to repeat it, and therefore, or how to retrieve or resurrect this moment of fusion of the heterogeneous agencies that leads to class, party, and theory being or be a single agent or subject, as I would say, we imagine the revolution, the Russian Revolution to have been, and the Chinese Revolution, yes, to have repeated that again. So he's caught, how not to be, he's caught in the paradox, I'm even tempted to say the absurd dilemma of developing a theory which entirely aims at justifying or presenting history in Machiavellian terms or others as the room of the unpredictable, while at the same time permanently thinking of the reiteration of the reproduction of a type of revolutionary event that has already taken place. Our problem is different. It is more Althusserian than his own in the deep ontological, structural sense. We cannot know which agencies, there are agencies around us, different types of agencies, utopias, insurrections, economic contradictions, movements, state policies, and so on. Which we cannot know which agencies can combine their heterogeneous temporalities in a manner that breaks with the existing structure or situation, rather, or transforms capitalism into something else, which could be very different things. But we can develop a critique of political economy and a critique of other discourses as well, probably. Because in reading Capital, because he reads Capital, Althusser is entirely focused on the critique of political economy. And I admit with him that this is determining in the last instance. But this is not, according to his own theory, the only instance that makes their multiplicity, their very multiplicity, intelligible. And you might want to say that making a social or historical multiplicity intelligible is not much if what we want is get rid of that shit, as Marx had once said about capitalism. I keep thinking that it's something. Sorry for the absurd length of this talk.
So, now we're going to get to the meat of the seminar, and in fact, this is precisely why we've modified the seminar from previous years. Was precisely to be able to get to the meat of the seminar without being pushed in too many different directions. And so you've just taken us right where we want to be with your final remarks. There were a number of pirouettes. Okay. There are a number of remarks that I would want to develop, starting from the preliminary remarks, which I think I'll just come back to, having to do with the larger context of Sartre's presence and Marxism as the horizon. It would be interesting to develop the notions of activism that you had suggested as opposite to theoreticism, particularly by looking at his discussion of theory and practice on pages 60 and 61 of the English edition. So students can return to those pages, I think, in relation to that conversation. I think it would be fascinating to come back to the question of pedagogism, particularly in relation to our last seminar in Rio on Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where we specifically addressed Rancière's The Ignorant Master and all of the questions surrounding the relationship between theoricism and pedagogy and pedagogy of the oppressed. I think we could also come back to the symptomatic method and in my opinion, what is often, it seems to me, kind of overly scientistic language about this method. Passages on pages 27 where he talks about, for instance, the invisible problematic contained in the paradox of an answer which does not correspond to any question posed, and the way in which actually, perhaps, I mean, those are unnecessarily scientific ways to refer to the kind of textual analyses that we do in terms of finding gaps and ambiguities and exploiting those, as we always do, particularly in post-structuralism, which is the whole effort at finding those gaps and ambiguities. But I think we should set those aside to continue the conversation where you ended it, because I think that that's the question for us today. To a certain extent, what I'd like to do is kind of like a drone. You know how they do that now all the time? The drone kind of moves up and all of a sudden you see a lot more space and you're flying at a higher level, and of course it's often a more simple level, but I think it's exactly where we could gain some traction. We could say that Althusser, possibly, this would be one hypothesis, like the other structuralists in the period, despite everyone's objections to the term structuralism, Foucault, Lacan, Lévi-Strauss, Barthes, etc., was a reaction on this question of agency, which you brought up. Okay, and it was a move to shift the focus from individual human agency to these broader relations, here relations of production, relations of power for others, but relations of production here. And that theoretical move, I take, was a reaction against the humanist tendencies of Sartre and of the Marxist existentialism, particularly of the period, which we'll be reading in January, and also the confrontation at the time with Stalinism, which you'll recall the dates here, right? I mean, 53, he dies. Khrushchev begins de-Stalinization at that period, but 64, Khrushchev is deposed, and there's a bit of a Stalinist restoration. So this is exactly when this work is happening. Now, the question for us is what was wrong with humanism or human agency? And one simple response could be that it didn't account for these structures of domination associated with relations of production, and therefore leads to ameliorism perhaps or something, and doesn't actually lead the way, as you were suggesting, to the revolutionary event. So the question now, I take it, is, and what you were suggesting is that making this intelligible could be helpful for us today, but I take it the question is whether this cleavage in Marxist thought that was at the heart of the text and of the interventions, what it could, how it could inform us and our politics today. Why return to this cleavage today in the political context, political debate that we have today, in the political situation that we face today? And so the question becomes, in other words, should we be reading Capital? Should we be reading Capital, right? And of course, these are very different questions. Some of these, we're returning to these classical texts, and some of them are going to be more productive than others. But there's a big question here as to whether next year, for instance, Critique 1313 should be reading Capital 1313, right? And so, no, I mean, and this is a serious question, right? Would it be beneficial to us in the current constellation? How would it be beneficial to us in the current constellation to be returning to this particular tension that was at the heart of this intervention, I take it, which was the pushing towards a scientific or a structural reading in this moment, in these times. Now, here's one hypothesis, or here's one suggestion, but I think I want to hear more. So unfortunately, maybe we'll have to continue the seminar longer. We only have a half hour, but I want to hear more from you, Etienne. I want to hear more in response to that specific question. I mean, rendering intelligible, I think, is helpful, but it's not enough for me. Okay. So here's one suggestion. We could return, or rather continue, because many are doing this, to place capitalist relations of production at the center of our political understanding and of our critique. And many are doing this today under the rubric of neoliberalism and critiques of neoliberalism. Okay? Now, the conceptual approach of Althusser then would map on, and could map, here would be one idea, on a focus on technology, on digital technology, on social media, on digital media. And in this way, the kind of more structural dimensions, rather than, and although we would have to explore this in the digital context, right? The more structural dimensions would be something about technology and about these new technologies, and these new technologies of digital governance. So, for instance, governing today is mapping onto digital advertising, right? The forms of governance that are taking place right now are modeled, are infused by our commercial advertising. The forms of governing that are going on right now from governments, politicians are using Google and Amazon approaches to us, to getting us, to shaping us as subjects by focusing on our digital doppelganger, trying to identify who we are and shape it. Okay, so I mean that would be one way to think about it. Now this would be pushing then the structural interpretation into the technologies, science and technology domain, which I think could have also an anti-humanist approach like Althusser. On that reading, maybe perhaps we need to go back to Capital to reread it and to reinterpret what Marx was doing, but not really because of, and perhaps we could find new value to questions of surplus value and value because of all of the surplus value that we are creating through our digital existence and productions. So maybe it would be returning to that text as perhaps a model for analyzing these questions of value production. So not so much because it is somewhat anachronistic, not so much for its analysis of the forms of capitalism that we face today, but for its analysis as a model for how we might approach technology today, a somewhat different, or maybe radically different object. But in any event, so that, I take it, is ultimately the question. It can be reduced to the question, is it worth going back to Capital, to Marx's Capital? And question, and yeah, I want you to answer this question for me. Yeah. Yeah.
So the easy way would be to sell, advertise my own little stuff on this issue, which I put under the heading towards or for a new critique of political economy. That's my obsession. And in a sense, I'll do that briefly. But let me put two preliminaries. First, humanism. The moral aspect of the question of humanism, which you can associate with human rights, solidarity, compassion, etc. There are nuances which are not unimportant. So Althusser found himself trapped, in a sense, in this dispute because he was hit in the back by the accusation. We know only too well why you are against humanism. That's because you defend brutal policies, dictatorial regimes, inhuman concepts of politics, whereas the question which is on the order of the day are the human rights. So he struggled to explain that the theoretical anti-humanism he had been talking about was not, of course, a practical anti-humanism. I remember a very funny moment when a Spanish friend, I had been invited to the Congreso Nacional de Filosofía de Mexico in Monterrey, and the Marxists there, they were divided into two camps, analyticals and Marxists, but each camp was again divided into two opposite fractions. So the analytics invited two completely antithetic people, one an old man from the Vienna Circle, wonderful, and a brutal cognitivist from Stanford, and the Marxists, of course, were divided into anti-humanists and humanists. So they invited Carlos Paris, who was a very interesting humanist Marxist, and at some point he said to me, "But you anti-humanists are very good people, after all." So that was the question, and I think that Foucault here provides interesting insights, because he was caught, in a sense, in the same controversy. And I recently taught a class here in the French department about debates on policy and human rights in France that everybody knows in the early 80s. Is there a politics of human rights? And as you know, as you remember, you know that better than anybody here, Foucault said, my point of view is not so much une politique des droits de l'homme than une politique des gouvernés. Politics. So he proposed a shift, which I believe is. But the essential fact is not there. The essential fact is, if we return to theoretical anti-humanism, is that Althusser repeatedly explained, that was never a mystery, that from his point of view, the kernel of the dominant ideology was not humanism alone. It was humanism plus economicism. And so I would very much agree with you that perhaps neoliberalism has the visibility or invisibility of each side is shifting and commuting all the time. So I don't think that an Althusserian, even a traditional Althusserian, would make difficulty in admitting that the essential problem today is economicism more than humanism. But the next question would be, where is some sort of humanism more than ever insisting or hiding or latent, even in the most economicist, utilitarian discourse. And Yahya Madra, a wonderful young colleague who is an economist and a psychoanalyst, but first of all an economist, who belongs, broadly speaking, to the Althusserian school from UMass that publishes Rethinking Marxism, has produced a very interesting book 2 years ago, I believe, whose title I don't remember completely, but it's something like The Return of Humanism into Contemporary Economic Theory. And it's a critique, of course, of the all market, the different, etc. So that's, I would say, the first point. The second point, and here I know that I will be once again frustrating you and probably others terribly, is that I wanted to say that, but I skipped it because I was already too long. The core of Althusser's notion of critique, or even his notion of science, and they are in fact inseparable in this respect, which is anti-empiricist in the strict sense, is you do not know the object. Knowledge is not the system of inquiries, and he could be wrong. He could be very wrong on that. Depending also on the kind of discipline that you have in mind, anthropology, that's hard to accept, I would say. You are not, there's no way you can face the object and look for the best possible methodology that would make it possible for you to provide a theoretical understanding or intelligibility of that object as such. The only possible way is an oblique way. That's why he insisted for Marx on the idea that the Spinozist, or the so-called Spinozist idea, that the theoretical works entirely takes place within the realm of abstractions, abstraction or concepts. But of course, this makes sense only if you immediately add that this realm is a conflictual one, and that the essential, that what you perform, you provide, you perform in the realm of abstraction or the realm of theory is a critique, a symptomatic reading, therefore a critique of the ideological representations of discourse, whatever, which not only mask, as every Marxist would be ready to explain, the object or the reality of capitalism, so that you have to push that aside in order to finally get to the real, to the object. But it's a very different idea. It's the idea that you know something about the object in as much as you make the ideological representations themselves intelligible, because these ideological representations are part of the reality itself, and a part that can never be completely eliminated. So that's not something I take for indisputable. But it leads me to capital. So one last word about that. I hope I make myself clear. I try to understand what I'm saying myself, of course. Okay, let's pass to capital. Yes. So that leads to your core question. No, yeah, I know what I wanted to say. Is that this is unsatisfactory for every, I'd say, straightforward realism, or even pragmatism, because in fact the object that needs to be made intelligible is not so much a static, stable object, structure in the descriptive sense of the term, tendencies, processes, etc. It's the practice. That's why the ideology is a constituent part of the object itself, and why the critique or the understanding, better, of the ideology is the crucial epistemological task. But then we come to capital, and here what I want to say is relatively simple. There's a clear blind spot, there's a blind spot in Althusser's description of that, which has to do with what you call the unnecessary scientific language, which makes Althusser come so close to positivist formulations from time to time. And this is the fact that Althusser seems to believe that this symptomatic reading has already taken place, something that Marx performed once for all. Therefore, he established, and that was my obsession when I wrote Fundamental Concepts, he established historical materialism on the firm basis of these categories, which are ktema esae, which are an acquisition forever, surplus value, labor force, and so on, and so on. Therefore, the symptomatic reading of Marx is useful to understand the difference between Marx and his predecessors, or the etc. But it's no longer apparently a concern or an interest when it comes not only to read Marx or to apply Marx, etc., but to transform Marx. When it comes to reading, not only in the sense of listening, as I said, which calls for another difficult question, because all this seems to have to do only with the dominant ideology, the economic discourse, and the others, where are they? But especially when it comes to rewriting capital. And what is on the order of the day today is absolutely not rereading Capital for the sake of learning once again what Marx had taught to the labor movement of the 19th century, namely that there's an exploitation of the labor force which forms the permanent basis for the accumulation process, etc., etc., etc. This is no longer the problem. So of course I will disagree with you in the sense that I don't believe that we can say just like any economist or sociologist does in the university or elsewhere, let's look at the new technologies and make it a theory of that. And even more obsessional, of course, than the new technologies are the externalities, the climate crisis, etc. So, is that the strength of Althusser or his weakness? I don't know. I cannot completely decide. But that a symptomatic reading is needed in order not to continue simply a Marxist theory, but to keep the element of intelligibility while transforming everything. My favorite image, which comes there's a vulgar version of that, and there is one sophisticated that comes from antiquity, is what remains of Theseus' boat when both the what you call la coque, the infrastructure or the and the sails have had to be changed. So the question really, what remains of Marx's critique of political economy when each and every of the categories that Marx had elaborated will have been changed? And here I think that there are interesting expressions at large. David Harvey's notion of the points of stress in Marxist theory, in his commentary, etc., I like very much. I combine them in a certain manner with the idea of symptomatic reading. But above all, I believe that the textual comparison and critical encounter and clash that we have to carry on is, of course, not, it's not unuseful, but it is not purely or simply the comparison between Marx and the classical political economy. It's a comparison between Marx and contemporary political economy. And here this is a crucial choice because so many Marxists believe, either as Marx had believed himself, that after Ricardo and his critique by Marx, there would no longer exist an economic discourse that would be scientific, that would not be purely apologetic. That was his expression. Or they believe that our neoliberal theorists, the ones that earn the Nobel or pseudo-Nobel prizes in economic theory, or teach here at Columbia or Harvard or any, etc., are pure ideologists of neoliberalism. Therefore, we have nothing to learn from them. This is completely wrong. This is totally wrong. We have to go through the mat, which is not a screen, but of course is an obstacle to the concepts, and embark, I would say, on a comparison between Marx, what Marx wrote of capitalism, and what they say about capitalism. I'll take only one example, which I find particularly interesting. The category human capital, which is at the core. Foucault identified that as the core of neoliberal political economy. So read Gary Becker, of course, and you start a conversation with him, so I don't have to convince you. But the genealogy of the category human capital is fascinating, because this was invented at the time of third world development programs, and it meant that Africa, Asia, Latin America had, in order to develop themselves, not to simply extract oil or other products, but develop what? Health, education, etc., all the things that were labeled at the time human capital, and of course that had a kind of social, collective, macroeconomic dimension. Then comes Becker, and he says, human capital is not a collective resource. It's an individual process of valorization of one's capacities in order to make them rewarding on the market. What is that? This is a reversal of Marx's concept of surplus value. It's a genial reversal. Marx had said, capital, that's labor crystallized. And Becker says, labor, or labor force, that's capital. Idiot. So here there is a point of stress, and there are of course others about externalities, about money. That's certainly crucial because we are. So what I'm saying here is frustrating in one sense. I don't believe that the Althusserian orientation makes it possible to jump into the real and with the help of a good, strong anti-capitalist orientation create the critical theory that we need. But I believe that a certain way of reading Althusser directly leads to the idea that the urgent task of on the order of the day is a new critique of political economy.
Okay, great. Here's what I would say, though, and I want to open it up at least a little bit to anyone who can stick on this theme and maybe propose something for Etienne to react against on this question of what would it be like to do this work today, right? But very quickly, let me just say two things. So that's fascinating because what's interesting, of course, is that in 1965, you could have chosen a text like Coe's the Coe's theorem or something like that, or the Coe's theorem, Ronald Coe's work from '61. Okay, yeah, he did, right. So I mean, there's a lag, and but so in other words, but there must have been. So I'm not sure what in France at that moment would have been kind of the dominant form of capitalist or theoretical work in France at that time. I know what would have been in the United States.
The French had moved to American universities.
Yes, right. But in other words, but here's one. So two things that are interesting is one. In '65, the decision is to read Marx,
Yes.
right? It could have been to read contemporary liberal economic theory in relationship to Marx also.
It should have been. No
Okay,
Marxist was
well,
doing
I wasn't going to say should, but it could have been. And so the question is, in a sense, well, maybe the answer is in the should, maybe, is what you're suggesting. But then the question would be reading Marx against the contemporary moment in that way, although it must have felt as if reading Marx alone was sufficient to do that, right?
No, what is striking when you read again reading Capital, and especially Althusser's chapters or my chapters, is the fact that it's all about the critique of political economy. But as so many readers and critical readers have denounced or said, in fact, there is very little political economy in there, or very little contemporary political economy. And this is, I would say, because the circle around Althusser and the circle of structuralism, precisely. Structuralism was a method, an orientation, a doctrine for the human social sciences, and particularly for anthropology and anything that could be aggregated, I would say, to anthropology. So, to put it bluntly, even not being able to say it as clearly as that, we shared the idea still so strong today among économistes atterrés, that is, people who in departments of political economy or around desperately struggle to reverse the domination of the Chicago schoolboys, or even people who are much more sympathetic, of course, Paul Krugman and some others, but using essentially the same methodology, to introduce the idea that there is no such thing as pure economic objects or phenomena, but these are always social phenomena with anthropological dimensions and historic determinations. Therefore, the call, it's even a political struggle inside the French academia, from so-called critical economists and non-mainstream economists, is bring back the social. And Althusser's structuralism or historical materialism was a theory of the social, or a way of understanding the effet de société, or problematizing the intelligibility of the effet de société, more than in fact a direct confrontation with economic discourse, except in the past.
But it also reflects, right? I mean, a completely different moment somehow. I think that's in part what you're saying. It's a completely different moment today in which, and we're going to end just in a few minutes. It's a completely different moment in which it doesn't feel as if it would be possible to return simply to capital, that it has to be complemented. And in some part, that's a reflection of its, well, rewritten, but also rewritten, but as you were saying yourself, right, it would be necessary to read it in conjunction with something like Becker's theory of human capital or some other form of contemporary liberal economic theory, right? Whereas in 1965, it might have been possible to say, we are at a moment, or there might have been a belief that the horizon was possible, that we could just be reading capital. So that in itself is...
I know that I'm abusing that. No, just because nobody can speak.
No.
But, let me give you another example. I mentioned Poulantzas, I mentioned Badiou. Of course, they were reading or they were emulating Althusser in very different directions. But another person is very interesting here. Nobody will know her in this audience, I'm afraid. Although last year there was a memorial conference, and our Italian colleague helped me, the economist from Bergamo, organized the conference. This person is Suzanne de Brunhoff. Suzanne de Brunhoff. So Suzanne de Brunhoff was a French Marxist economist, a little younger than Althusser, so rather his generation than mine. She was working on the issue of money. The issue of money is absolutely central for today's critique, I believe. And from this point of view, the Marxists are torn between two tendencies which in fact have no real difference with the two tendencies that divide the bourgeois or mainstream economic theorists. These are the famous two orientations that Schumpeter distinguishes in his history of economic theories. For some, the real object, the important object is the so-called real economy. The monetary structures are additional, artificial, in a sense, institutions which produce crises, so you have to deal with that. It's embarrassing. And invade everyday life. So we are all indebted now. Credit governs everything. But ultimately, the cause or the determining factor is the transformation of the real economy, in which you can, of course include, and probably must include increasingly, the environmental problem. So on the other side, you have the opposite tendency, for which capitalism is essentially a monetary economy, and of course, and that means, of course, that you have to choose. Keynes was, to some extent, on that side. You have to choose between the two ways of viewing, in the beginning of Marxist Capital, the cycle. Commodity, money, commodity plus a surplus, or money, commodity, transformation into a commodity, money. So Marx says, it's fascinating, at the beginning of Capital, these two possibilities are symmetric. One mirrors the other. But the materialist point of view privileges the real circuit, the one where money is just a mediation, however complicated it is. Why? Because, of course, ultimately it is real labor, material labor, living labor, that creates a surplus value. And money does not create anything. So Suzanne de Bruneuf was working on that, and she was an Althusserian in some sense. She used everything from reading Capital, over-determination, multiple temporalities, etc., etc. But for an original work, which is centered on the question of the reproduction of the universal equivalent. Therefore, you can criticize many things she says, and what's his name? I forgot, etc. But or the American partner of is a professor here, James Foley. He's a very good. So tendentially, she reverses the point of view, and that's a heightened point of dispute, not only among Marxists but also among non-Marxist economists. And here you have to choose one side, and I choose the opposite of Marx, because I believe that in fact it's the monetary circuit that drives the real economy and not the reverse.
So then we're going to end on this simple question with apologies. We'll have to continue this and have the full seminar at another date. We will. Here's the simple question. We can't say today, and this is for all of us as students today, 2019, we're not going to read Becker. However much I admire and loved Gary Becker, that seems like that would be a difficulty. So then assuming, and I'll give the texts for the contemporary economics. What would be the text? What would be the other text we would read in relation? Would it still be Capital? No, in other words, so I'll take care of the contemporary economic work, and I'll find the right text.
To have Capital on your table is not a bad idea. there is a lot in Capital.
Okay. All right. So we will continue the conversation. Thank you so much, Etienne.